Welcome, everyone, to the onpoli podcast. I'm Steve Paikin.
And I'm John Michael McGrath.
Today on the pod, very concerning developments in Brampton as Stellantis pulls the plug on an auto plant retooling and makes a $13 billion investment in the United States.
Doug Ford tells a Bay Street audience that he chased, tracked down, and threatened to beat up a guy he suspected of being a shoplifter, and that little revelation has started quite the debate.
And speaking of the premier, he confirms we'll spend $75 million on a U.S.-based ad campaign, essentially aimed at one viewer, Donald Trump. But will the president get the message?
And in your column, my column, I will return to the topic of empty beer and wine containers here in Ontario.
One of his faves. And I've got a piece on a group of former MPPs who want to tell the premier, as long as you're bringing back the pension plan for current members of the legislature, how about us?
It's Friday, October 17th, 2025, so let's get to it.
JMM, a little sugar to get started.
Hello, sir.
A little sugar with some Cylon on top.
Yes.
Aren't you impressed I got that reference?
I'm very impressed by you, sir.
Yeah.
Yes, this is a Battlestar Galactica t-shirt, the last of the set that my wife got at Fan Expo this year. So we wore Jays, or I wore Jays last week, and we had a bit of a rough start to the ALCS. So I'm thinking I won't jinx it, but if the Jays do well in the next few games, maybe I will bring a Jays t-shirt back.
Now, I actually don't know. Is that for the reboot or is that for the original? Because I watched the original when I was a kid.
Yes. This, I believe, is a reference to the reboot, the 2002 series.
Oh, yeah, definitely the reboot.
Yeah, So Say We All, I believe that was also used in the original, but I mostly remember Edward James Olmos delivering that line, particularly from the pilot. Edward James Olmos also, of course, will play Ernest Drury in that biopic.
In the movie version of, yes, the man who, he's a very historically important figure, which is why I'm wearing him today. Here's the deal. We've had 44 elections in the history of the province of Ontario since Confederation. 44. 42 of them have been won by Conservatives or Liberals. 2 of them were not. I know you know one of them.
Yes, I was alive for one of them, Bob Rae in the NDP.
Ray, 1990, exactly right. That was the NDP. The other one is this guy.
Yep.
And it was 106 years ago this weekend, in 1919, that the United Farmers of Ontario won the Ontario election. And if I'm just going to go back here a little bit, you remember a few weeks ago, I had James Whitney on, the only premier to die in office. Then the following week, it was William Hearst, who took over for Whitney.
Yes.
Then after Whitney finished out that term, this guy came in by defeating him. And I actually have to watch how I say that, because the United Farmers were not expecting to win, so they ran in that election without a leader. Drury did not run in that election. He was the leader of the party, but he didn't even run. Then they won the election. Then they said, well, it looks like we're going to need a premier. You may need to get back in here after all. So somebody stepped down. They had a by-election. And it was a year later, in 1920, that Drury actually then assumed his seat in the legislature. So besides Bob Rae, he is the only non-Tory, non-Liberal to become the Premier of Ontario, our 6th Premier. Alas for him, also, like Bob Rae, just one term and out. However, I think it's also fair to say, like Bob Rae, a kind of a very neat post-Premier political experience. He was appointed the Sheriff and Registrar of Simcoe County, that's Barrie, Ontario, basically, and environs, a position which he held until 1959 when he was in his 80s.
Wow.
So he actually had a very long contributing career to public life. And as I was talking with our director, Sheldon Osmond, before the program, he looked at my shirt and he said, oh, that's the guy they named the School of the Deaf in Milton after. And I was deeply impressed for the first time in my life with Sheldon. Because, yes, that's quite right. The Ernest C. Drury School for the Deaf is in Milton. That's one thing named after him. So there we go.
And I'm trying to remember, I'm sure I should have brushed up on this before we started recording, but the United Farmers were not, as we say, they only ever won the one election. But that doesn't mean they weren't influential in subsequent years, right? Like some of the policies that they were agitating for.
Absolutely, very much so.
Important.
Yes, enhanced pensions for widows and children. Yeah. That would certainly be one thing. Obviously, improvements in policies for farmers. That was what they were all about. They were this agrarian protest movement. So, yeah, for sure. And Ernest Drury was the longest living premier of Ontario ever. He lasted till age 91 until who?
Are we doing an obligatory Bill Davis
We
reference?
are, of course, yeah. Bill Davis, when he died, it's coming up to 5 years ago, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah, he was 92. So Bill Davis is now the longest-lived Ontario premier ever, defeating the record of Ernest Drury, who was 91. So there we go.
All right.
That's our little history lesson, our little walk down the yellow brick road of Ontario political history for this week.
Via T-shirts.
Via T-shirts. That's how we do it. And with that, let's get off to issue one. The auto manufacturer Stellantis, which makes Dodge, Jeep, and Ram vehicles, among others, is investing $13 billion in the United States with an aim to increase vehicle production by 50%. The first casualty in this move is Brampton, Ontario. How so, JMM?
In a press release, Stellantis noted that their plans will add 5,000 jobs at plants in Illinois, Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana over the next 4 years. Now, that does not necessarily mean Ontario will be losing those 5,000 jobs, but we're certainly not gaining 5,000, especially in Brampton, where there were plans to retool a manufacturing plant. Those plans have been stalled since earlier this year in February. That plant had 3,000 workers, and they have been off work ever since. Unifor National President Lana Payne, who represents auto workers across Canada, said that, quote, Canadian auto jobs are being sacrificed on the Trump altar.
You can tell this story has cut through because my hockey buddies this morning when I played were talking about it.
Right, yeah.
And actually one of the questions they had was, didn't we give them a lot of money? And what's the answer to that?
We did. Back in 2022, Stellantis announced it was investing $3.6 billion to shift the Windsor and Brampton plants towards electric vehicle production. This, of course, was in the era of the Inflation Reduction Act under then President Joe Biden. The federal government in Ontario said that they would provide $1.4 billion. In February, Stellantis paused the retooling of the Brampton facility, as I mentioned, after the announcement of 25% tariffs by the current president, Donald Trump, and the federal, provincial, and now even municipal governments are pushing the company to keep its promise to keep operating both its Windsor and Brampton plants.
Tariffs, I presume, have a role in all of this.
Yes, exactly. Stellantis has already reported a loss of $3.7 billion in the first half of the year, which they have largely credited or blamed to tariffs. The company says they expect the losses to be even higher in the second half of the year unless something changes, like Canada and the U.S. agreeing to a trade deal, or one might add, the Supreme Court affirming that these tariffs are illegal. That said, this is basically what the president wants, right? He has said that, this is what America first means, right? Canadian auto jobs, particularly auto assembly jobs, coming back to the United States. It's worth clarifying. I just use the phrase coming back to, but as others have noted, there is no back to, right? Like the Canadian and American auto sectors grew up together. Yeah. They did not. Canadians have not poached auto jobs from the U.S. So I'll try to be more careful about my language. But in any case, at the moment, I think this is not obviously not a win for Ontario. It looks like this is a win for Trump and for Trumpism, if we can say that. And to that, I would just say boo.
Well, we know Doug Ford was on the phone to the head of Stellantis when he got the news, and he's trying to lobby in his particular way. What about the feds? What have they got up their sleeve here?
Right. And so let's just remind people that the vast majority of the subsidies that Stellantis and others have been offered under those agreements, the electric vehicle production credits, they are overwhelmingly federal subsidies. There has been a smaller provincial role in subsidizing these things, but the real money is coming from Ottawa. And so the federal government is considering legal action against Stellantis. Melanie Joly, the Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry, sent a letter to Stellantis pointing out that they signed a deal and the federal government is willing to enforce its legal commitments after taking money from multiple government programs, including the Strategic Innovation Fund. She also reminded the company that the Canadian government was there for them when then Chrysler, now Stellantis, declared bankruptcy in 2009. Whether this has any impact on the company's decisions, of course, we'll have to see.
Well, a company is not going to make a decision that will require them to face an existential crisis, right? If they think they're going to lose money, they're going to renege on the deal. Yeah. And the question then becomes whether any impact that we attempt to have to get them to change their mind will work. Do we have any Examples in history? Do we know whether or not pressure from politicians can get them to change their minds?
Well, so, consider the losses that I mentioned earlier, right? The billions of dollars in losses that they've already faced this year, expecting billions of dollars more, right? Those losses are already comparable to the subsidies that Stellantis was being offered by the federal government. So, one possibility here is that Stellantis doesn't take the federal government's threat seriously, that they expect that they will keep these subsidies, even if they figure out some kind of face-saving way to perhaps keep the Brampton plant operating at a lower level with a smaller number of jobs there, and they'll get to both shift their production to the U.S. and keep their subsidies from the Canadian government. That might be one assumption that they're offering or operating on. The other assumption, and one I think that the federal government should take seriously, is that they're looking at billions of dollars in losses from these tariffs. They may decide that, subsidies or not, it is not worth staying in Canada at the level that they are. And if it's not worth it for Stellantis, it might not be worth it for GM, or it might not be worth it for Ford. And those are going to be considerations that all of the automakers are going to have to make in the coming months. And it's a truly frightening prospect for the federal and provincial governments, because, there's still something like, I think, 150,000 auto jobs in Ontario, and
massive part of our economy.
Yeah, I don't think anybody could sort of say seriously right now that they know what the future is.
Donald Trump is not consistent on too much, I think is a nice charitable diplomatic way of putting it. But he has been consistent on tariffs throughout his adult life.
Yes.
And when Mark Carney went down to the Oval Office for his meeting last week, Donald Trump was unequivocal in saying, look, we're going to be number one in autos. You guys want to be number two, that's fine, but we're going to win. We're going to be number one. And so we just cannot be surprised that whatever policies he's going to advance are going to be designed to hurt us and help him, because I don't think the notion of a win-win is part of his vocabulary.
No, he very much seems to see the world in, I'm not going to try and engage in mind reading, but just based on public statements here, right? Very, very much believes in a zero-sum view of the world, right? He can only win, the United States can only win when other countries lose. And, what that means for our auto sector, unfortunately, is, there's really no idea that, even though, as I say, it is the historical fact that the American and Canadian auto sectors grew together, he just does not seem to believe that.
They came here for a reason, The American automakers set up plants in Canada for a reason. And this might be a good time to remind the president of what some of those reasons are.
Yeah.
Anyways, with that, we're off to issue 2. Doug Ford was being interviewed by 640 Toronto radio host Ben Mulrooney at the Empire Club this past week when the premier surprised the audience by confessing that he had tracked down and threatened to pummel an apparent shoplifter. Okay, what's the rest of the story here?
Right. So the incident took place in July while the premier was buying plants at a Home Depot in Muskoka. The Toronto Star has confirmed the veracity of the story. They spoke to Home Depot. Home Depot said, yes, this was a thing that happened. He was preparing his cottage to receive the Prime Minister, Mark Carney. We remember that Mark Carney spent the night at Doug Ford's cottage, and they stayed up all night saying they were going to solve the world's problems.
It was a nice pajama party, from what I hear.
Anyway, he was getting the house ready, making it nice and pretty for the Prime Minister, as one does. When he says he noticed the shoplifter, we have a clip of the Premier's retelling of the incident.
Pull up behind him and jump into the car. I said, buddy, what's in your bag? Nothing's in my bag. I said, buddy, I'm going to kick your ass all over the parking lot. Show me what's in your bag. And I did. I couldn't help myself. And then I went on to tell him if I ever see him in the parking lot, he's going to get a beating like he's never got before. But that's what you have to do.
Okay, just an innocent question here, but is that what the recommended course of action is when you see somebody that you think is guilty of shoplifting?
Well, Home Depot says no. Let's start with that. We could talk more about that in a minute. But we also got some reaction from the leader of the official opposition, Ontario NDP leader Marit Stiles, friend of the podcast. She reacted to the incident. Let's take a look at that.
Well, what is he doing talking about chasing down a shoplifter in a parking lot. You know, we don't need Captain Canada. We don't need Batman. We need a premier who's actually fighting for jobs in this province.
So, we should mention that this event took place early in the morning. The premier said that he actually evaded his own OPP security detail, as one does, to go shopping on his own. You know, the OPP might have been able to intervene in a, let's say, more regular fashion than having the Premier of Ontario and leader of His Majesty's government threaten to beat a guy up in a parking lot. So yeah, that's that story.
This is, I mean, some people are going to be asking, why are you guys talking about this? It was kind of a throwaway storyline in the middle of a conversation with Ben Mulrooney. And the answer is because this is the perfect Doug Ford story. He eludes his OPP detail. So there's Doug Ford, the maverick, right? Doing something you're not supposed to be doing. He chased after a criminal. So there's Doug Ford putting his money
Alleged
where his...
criminal.
Correct.
Would you say as
Very
journalist?
good point. Alleged criminal, yes. So there's Doug Ford putting his money where his mouth is. He's tough on crime. He did exactly what authorities tell you never to do.
Yes.
He approached someone that he really had no idea whether the guy was armed with a knife, with a gun, with who knows what. Why? For the purposes of repatriating a $15, $20 saw, I don't know what. So that's Doug Ford, the guy who breaks with convention when he feels he needs to. And of course, it all worked out, right? He didn't get attacked. He didn't end up getting hurt. He ended up having a good story to tell. So that's Doug Ford, the very fortunate, lucky politician, of which we have seen lots of evidence over the last 7.5 years. It's all there in this one story.
Yeah, and so, as you say, kind of a classic story. I mentioned the reporting from the Toronto Star, and they spoke to experts in retail security. They do not recommend intervening like this. They say the best course of action is to take notes, report incidents like this to the police. I got to say, I worked retail for many years before. I guess the last retail place I worked would have been 2011, 2012, that kind of thing, before I got full-time work as a reporter. No, you were never, ever, ever supposed to confront shoplifters unless you were the paid security people. And even they had very, very strict rules about how they were supposed to, confront people.
So you never did?
No, I never did.
You never did. But then again, I mean, you're not 6 feet and 300 pounds as the premier is. He makes my guess is when the premier confronts somebody in a parking lot over a stolen saw, he looks like a fairly compelling figure.
I would imagine
the size.
seeing him getting out of his car, which is also a substantial vehicle.
Yeah.
It would I imagine the whole vibe was quite intimidating.
Yeah. Now, believe it or not, when Doug Ford came to the Empire Club to have his conversation with Ben Mulrooney, this was not meant to be the topic of conversation at the event.
This was not the government message track.
There actually was. The government actually intended to get a message forward to this Bay Street audience. So maybe we should spend a minute or two on what the actual Gainsburger of the day was supposed to be.
Yes, absolutely. So I think to me the most interesting bit was that the premier previewed that a new red tape reduction bill is coming. And these are a regular part of the legislative calendar. In this case, it will be the Minister of Red Tape Reduction, Andrea Kanjan, who is... will bring forward a bill, a variety of different. I mean, these bills, they always touch, dozens of different things, right? They make little tweaks to all sorts of laws. In some cases, they might repeal something big, but the premier says, obviously at the beginning of the year, well, after the election, the government brought forward Bill 5, which was all about giving the government a free hand to clear high priority projects and modify any law that they needed to, in much the same way that the federal government passed Bill C5. But Ford wanted to emphasize in his speech that this is not, it's not just about these single high priority projects, that it's also about clearing the way for the for industry generally, and so making lowering the regulatory burden on business generally. We don't have any details about exactly what that will entail. He also alluded to some implementation of changes to the Endangered Species Act. That was obviously something that was passed earlier this year. That has raised some alarm bells from environmental critics as well. But we will get a clearer idea of what is in this new red tape reduction bill when it gets presented in the legislature because, of course, MPPs return to Queen's Park next week.
You know, JMM, now that I think of it, most premiers are not just premiers. They tend to be premiers plus, who knows, Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs. That's what a lot of them do. I remember Kathleen Wynne was premier and agriculture minister for a little while as well.
Yes.
Clearly, Doug Ford wants to be premier and the minister responsible for meting out a case of whoop-ass to anybody who steals a saw, which is a new portfolio I was unaware of, but there we go.
You know, I don't remember that in any of my constitutional law classes, but, clearly this is one of those powers reserved to the Crown and also Doug Ford.
Never stop learning. There we go. And on to issue 3 we go. Ever since Donald Trump became president again, the government of Ontario has been trying to tell him that his tariff plans are, well, shall we just say counterproductive. So far, Trump's not buying. But the government isn't giving up. We will spend $75 million in commercials on U.S. TV trying to get Trump to change his tariff policy. And this time, if I may say, the ad is actually quite brilliant. Have a listen.
When someone says, let's impose tariffs on foreign imports, it looks like they're doing the patriotic thing by protecting American products and jobs. And sometimes for a short while it works, but only for a short time. But over the long run, such trade barriers hurt every American worker and consumer. America's jobs and growth are at stake.
I got to confess, that is, that ad really works on me because I'm of the generation that, of course, remembers who that guy was. If you're listening to us as opposed to watching us right now, you may remember that voice belonged to the 40th president of the United States, Ronald Wilson Reagan. This is back in 1987, near the end of his second term. This was back in the day when Republicans actually believed in freer trade and in having good relations with Canada. Yes. That is, neither one of those tenets are really part of the Republican Party's platform anymore. What do you think of the thing?
You know, it was a good ad. That said, I have some reservations about how effective it will be, right? Just back in March, President Trump took a few swipes at Ronald Reagan saying that he was bad on trade. So not sure that message will sway the commander-in-chief. Back in 2023, the website Politico did a pretty lengthy story about this long feud between Trump and his allies on the one side and the Reagan Presidential Library and the foundation on the other. Long story short, not a lot of love lost between Camp Trump and Camp Reagan. There are, of course, still many Republicans who do admire Reagan's memory and his contribution to conservative politics, but they're not terribly close to the current president. So this ad might not be very well targeted, is all I'm saying. That said, it's not like I've got any better ideas. So, and perhaps, there are more Republicans than just the president or the people close to him. There are state governors, there are senators, there are lots of people whom Canadian policymakers worked with really well in the first Trump administration. It's a different environment in the second Trump administration, and I'm not sure how well this will work, but you got to try something, I guess.
Yeah, and it's a really beautiful ad, and it harkens back to a time when Republican presidents and Canada seemed to care about each other a lot more and implemented policies that were to the mutual benefit of both countries.
And that speech was, as Reagan and the U.S. and Mulroney and Canada were negotiating the first free trade agreement.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm not sure there has been a more close relationship between any Canadian prime minister and any American president than Brian Mulroney and Ronald Reagan. And both countries benefited as a result of that relationship, that personal relationship. I note that when Premier Ford was up in Kenora earlier this week to do a news conference there, that he took a rather different tack from the current Prime Minister of Canada, who, when he goes down to the Oval Office, does a lot of, it's a lot of thumbs up, and it's a lot of laughing at the president's jokes, and it's a lot of calling him a transformational leader in the world. And, he's obviously trying to get on his good side. Doug Ford called Donald Trump that tyrant. Yeah. Says he's a real piece of work. Says if we can't get a deal, let's start hitting back. I am sick and tired of rolling over. He drives me absolutely crazy. These are some of the things that Doug Ford is saying about Donald Trump. And who knows whether the mix of all of that rhetoric plus these commercials will actually start to garner some enthusiasm and support for the Canadian position on this trade dispute. But as you point out, nobody's got a better idea at the moment. So I guess it's a bit like chicken soup. Can't hurt.
Yeah, and I just think, what does hitting America back look like? I mean, we tried some retaliatory tariffs. We dropped those. The Premier Ford tried threatening surcharges on electricity exports to U.S. jurisdictions, and then backed off in the face of what seemed to be a very angry American reaction. The Americans are still quite angry that the LCBO has taken U.S. liquor off the shelves. It's one thing to be angry, and if I were the Premier, I would be angry too. But I don't know what the next step is. So.
The next step is for us to move on and talk about the columns we wrote for the TVO website
Absolutely.
this week. Your column, my column, coming up next. Okay, JMM, we love this segment. It's called Your Column, My Column, in which we talk about the stuff that we wrote for TVO.org this past week. What have you got for us?
Right. So I have talked about this subject before, the fate of Ontario's deposit return program. This is, how formerly with the beer store, you could bring empty cans and bottles of beer and wine to the beer store to return for a deposit. The fate of that program, now that you can buy beer and wine at any grocery store or corner store that is licensed to do so, is a big open question, because the beer store is closing locations. They no longer have a retail monopoly. They have been permitted by the province to start shutting down stores, and they are doing so quite quickly. And in some communities, particularly in like northern and rural Ontario, that is leaving people with no place to return their empties, or, they have to drive 2 hours to get to the nearest beer store location. This has all sorts of wild implications about things like, how much longer our landfills will last. But right now, let's just say it's very irritating for a lot of residents, and grocery stores, particularly large grocery stores, are supposed to start accepting empties everywhere starting January 1st. Some locations are supposed to have already started accepting empties, and they have not been. And this week I got word that the Alcohol Gaming Commission of Ontario has started actually enforcing these rules. They've issued notices to some large grocery stores, one from Costco, two owned by Metro, that it's time to get with the program and start accepting these empties. This is all happening in the context of the government and the big retailers in particular still trying to negotiate. They are trying to figure out what comes next. And we've talked about this before on the podcast. Finance Minister Peter Bethlenfalvy's position is basically like, this was always the deal. You gotta start accepting the empties, or you can just stop selling beer and wine. Nobody's forcing you to sell beer and wine, but this is the deal. The grocers would really like to not accept empties. They've been on this for decades. They just don't want the job.
So just so I'm clear, they would like all the profits of being able to sell beer and wine in their stores without any of the responsibility of dealing with the waste.
Yes, correct.
Okay.
They want all of the money and none of the responsibility. There are other things that the government might be able to negotiate on, though. Currently, bars and restaurants and some corner stores get a bigger discount on the beer and wine that they buy from the LCBO. They get 15%. Grocery stores only get 10%. The government might be able to move on that, but on the other hand, that potentially has a fiscal impact, because LCBO profits make their way eventually to the to the provincial treasury. The other issue is whether large grocery stores might be allowed to sell their own house label beer and wine. At the moment, they are not allowed to, but like Costco would love to sell its Kirkland brand wines, which they sell all over the US and in other provinces, but they can't sell here in Ontario. Similar stories with the other large grocers, but the other big interest group here is Ontario's own resident, like craft brewers and vineyards and wineries, who very much do not want to be in the position of having to compete against Loblaws for Loblaws' own shelf space, right? So these are all a bunch of issues that we are going to see how this all resolves. And the government, as we record this, government has about 75-ish days to figure out how this is going to unfold on January 1st.
How confident are you it will resolve?
I suspect you're going to get a bunch of different things happening. Like I would not be surprised if some retailers at least try to bluff the government and say, well, as of January 1st, we no longer will be selling beer and wine, and see if they can cause enough of a fuss. Others, I suspect, will figure out a way to make empties happen. It's just going to be a matter of seeing who really digs their heels in or not.
To be continued.
Yes, exactly. And you?
Well, I got to quote my hockey buddies again. My hockey buddies are filled with wisdom. When I want to know what real normal people feel about various issues, I don't talk to you. I don't talk to...
No, not us weirdos.
No, not us poly nerds, on-poly nerds. No. I go talk to the regular people. And my hockey buddies are people who sort of follow issues a little bit, but are not neck deep in it all. And usually once every couple of years or so, somebody in the dressing room will go on a great rant about, those damn politicians at Queen's Park, they're getting their fat pensions and they're just, constantly getting salary increases. And it's at that point that I let them blow off a little steam and then say, not to put too fine a point on this, but you do know that Mike Harris got rid of the pension plan 30 years ago. Yeah. And that, until Doug Ford brought forward a raise not too long ago, they hadn't had a raise in 15 years. I'm not saying you should have any sympathy, but I'm just saying these are the facts. You did know that, yes. Didn't you? And I get these looks around the drawing.
Blank stares.
Yeah, absolutely. Blank stares. No, actually, we didn't know that. Well, yeah, that's actually the way it's been. So one of the things I constantly hear from people who are trying to recruit on behalf of political parties, citizens to put their names on a ballot and run for office, is that nobody is going to walk away from a decent job when there's no pension at Queen's Park, right? MPs get what they call gold-plated pensions. But as I say, Mike Harris got rid of the pension 30 years ago, and it's been very difficult to recruit good people, quote unquote, to run for office if there's no pension. So after 30 years of no pension, Doug Ford made a decision, I guess about a month ago, in which he said, we're going to bring back the MPP's pension plan, which means that if you are in the current Legislative Assembly of Ontario, you're eligible. Yeah. It also means that if you had a pension as an MPP before Mike Harris got rid of it in 1995, you got a pension, or you got bought out, one of the two. For the whole group of MPPs now, between 1995 and today, there is no MPP's pension. There was an RSP, which the public put some money into, and the members put some money into, but it was certainly not what you would call a pension that could get you whatever. $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 a month.
Not the same type of income security.
Absolutely not. And income security, I'm glad you used that expression, because we all remember the story of Lorenzo Berardinetti, who was a former Liberal MPP who found himself homeless, divorced, living in a homeless shelter because for whatever reason, for a bunch of reasons, no doubt, he had no income. And this is a former, I think, 15-year member of the Ontario legislature. So Peter Sherman, who's a former Thornhill MPP for the Progressive Conservatives, I think he's been the most vocal guy trying to get in touch with Doug Ford and saying, look, the pre-95 people had pensions, the 2025 and beyond people have pensions. How about those of us who served in the 30 years in between? Yeah. Shouldn't we be eligible for a pension? So that's the showdown right now. The former politicians who don't have them are going to continue to lobby for them. And we'll see where this whole thing goes. I'm not making a position. I'm not taking a position one way or another on whether they should or they shouldn't. I put the story up on the website. There have been some interesting comments about, you mean they didn't have pensions? Well, of course they should have pensions. All the way from that to, no sympathy. When you ran, you knew there wasn't one. So tough luck. So, okay, bring on the debate.
Yeah, I mean, it occurs to me that of the dozens of MPPs who are affected by this 30-year gap, there are at least two former premiers, right? Dalton McGuinty would not have a pension under the current rules, and neither does Kathleen Wynne.
Right.
And so I'm not sure that Doug Ford would necessarily be swayed by who the beneficiaries of a policy change would be, right? The question, though, I think the bigger question, I would be shocked if nobody had actually looked at this somewhere in the bowels of the finance ministry, but to suddenly retroactively give dozens of people pensions, it's probably not.
It's $10 million.
Huge sums. Okay.
It's $10 million. It's peanuts. I mean, on a $300 billion budget, it's peanuts.
Yes,
So
that's
at the
a
end of the
rounding
day,
error of a rounding error.
yeah, at the end of the day, it's not a question of can we afford it. Of course they can afford it. It's a question of do they want to do it.
Yeah.
And, the premier has to make a decision about everybody's always thought over the years, we can't bring the pension back because the political price we would have to pay to do so would be so enormous and nobody's going to want to do it.
Yeah.
And then Doug Ford made the announcement that he's going to bring in pensions for 2025 MPPs and beyond. And did you notice the reaction at Young and Bloor? Did you see the masses of people who were protesting at Young and Bloor against it? Oh, no, wait a second. Nothing happened.
Decided lack of torches and pitchforks.
There was no reaction whatsoever. So anyway, we'll watch the story unfold. It is of interest. Now, if you've got a burning question or insightful comment, we always like to hear from you at onpolitics@tvo.org. Well, okay, tell us about our weekly. There we go, weekly. Tell us about our weekly email for this week.
Right. So we have an email from listener Dan King from rural Middlesex County, just north of Alcia Craig. Hi, Steve and John Michael. I've been a longtime follower of JMM's reporting for TVO and on the website formerly known as Twitter, and I've been watching Steve for even longer, starting with my parents insisting on putting on Studio 2 instead of whatever cartoons I wanted to watch in middle school. I'm glad now that John Michael often brings some science fiction and cartoon content into my Ontario politics coverage with his graphic tees, like this week.
There we go.
I'm writing to ask what kind of discussions at Queen's Park have occurred around the hiring freeze being imposed on provincial agencies. The only coverage I've seen thus far is presented in a matter-of-fact way and doesn't address that this freeze is coming in at a time that the provincial deficit has come in much lower than forecast, or that the province is not the sole funding source for these agencies, who often also receive grants from federal and or municipal funds, as well as charitable foundations, and by collecting their own fees. I guess my question is, what gives? This is being imposed at a time when unemployment in Ontario is trending in the wrong direction, and Doug Ford is signaling to young people that they just need to look harder for work. Why would the province cut off one of these avenues for employment? Thanks for your consideration of my question. I will be delighted to hear either of you read it on air. Sincerely, Dan.
Dan, I'm glad you got in for a couple of reasons. Number one, we are going to talk about what you just referenced. But the second thing is, as you were reading that, I looked on my, what do you call it here?
Your phone?
Yeah,
Google
phone.
Maps?
That's it. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, maps. There you go. And Ailsa Craig, Ailsa, second word Craig, Craig, which I've never heard of, and I guess you haven't either.
No.
Is between London and Grand Bend in southwestern Ontario. So I've learned about a new place here.
And is named after a island in Scotland in the outer Firth of Clyde, according to Wikipedia.
There we go. Look how much we're learning here. Okay. Well, I'm not going to comment on the advisability of the government doing this. It's obviously their policy, and people can decide whether they think it makes sense. The principle here is that the so-called ABCs of government, agencies, boards, and commissions, can only afford to have so many employees. And if, in the view of the government of the day, that number gets too high relative to the revenue coming in, which you need in order to be able to afford to pay all these people, if the numbers don't work and it's impossible to balance the budget, then you've got a problem. So we have to remember that 3/4 of government expenditures, 3/4 are salaries to public servants. So you have to get the balance right. You obviously can't. I think we're seeing right now in Ottawa, Mark Carney believes that the federal government under Justin Trudeau became bloated and far too big relative to the revenue coming in to support it. And therefore, he is starting to, and we'll hear more in November when the first budget comes out for the Carney government, he is starting to retrench. Now, as it happens, I spoke to the president of the Treasury Board, Caroline Mulrooney, a couple weeks ago, because I wanted to understand about this hiring freeze and how hard and fast it was. And, for example, what if the ABCs make the case to the minister that, this is an emergency and we really have to fill this position. I know the freeze is on, but we have to have it. And her answer was, well, if it's an emergency, if it's truly urgent, they can make the case. And if they make it well, we'll unstick the freeze and then they can hire whoever they have to hire. But to be sure, they're going to have to make a very persuasive case because at the moment, the whole idea is to shrink the size of the public service in the province of Ontario.
Yeah, and so the government, when they announced this, they said that the broader provincial public service, and that's the language they use for everybody who works for an agency, board, or commission, that the payroll had grown substantially since 2022, and that it was time to sort of pare things back. In case it's not obvious, we should maybe need to mention that, like, TVO as a agency of government is bound by the hiring freeze.
Oh, can I throw one more thing in on that? Yeah. Because I did ask the minister, Caroline Mulrooney, TVO does not have a CEO at the moment, right?
Yes.
Our previous CEO left and the job is being filled on an interim basis, but there's no permanent position filled. And she said, I was asking innocently. I wasn't asking on behalf of anybody, just an innocent question. And her answer was, that sounds like that would be an urgent hire, and we would lift the freeze in order to appoint a CEO for TVO. So to members of the board who may who may not have known that, anyway, there's some information for you.
Yeah, and so I think it is possible. Again, not commenting on the advisability of the policy, as you say, this is the government's choice. There was one thing that Dan mentioned about the deficit coming in lower than expected, and that is true for the fiscal year that has just ended.
Yes.
However, the fiscal year that we are in right now, and that will continue until April 1st, the deficit is basically just on track for what they had projected. It has not gotten worse, but it has also not gotten any better. And so the government obviously would like that deficit to shrink. It is projected to be quite large next year, larger than it was in the year that just ended. And, this is obviously one of the measures they are taking to try and get that deficit under control. And, just to sort of talk about some of the others. Yes, I mean, Dan's absolutely right that it's not a great time to be looking for work in Ontario right now. NDP leader Marit Stiles has emphasized, 800,000 people looking for work in Ontario, and that is all true. But it is also the case that the government does want to manage the deficit, and as the economic news potentially could get worse, let's refer back to what we were just talking about Stellantis there. As that economic news gets worse, the deficit could also get worse, and the government doesn't want to let the public, clearly does not want to let the public service continue to grow, let the cost of that payroll expand, and suddenly find that, actually next year our revenues are even worse than we already thought. So.
Precisely. You want to give the email and we'll get out of here?
Absolutely. Again, if you'd like to ask about content on the show, please email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
And that is the onpoli podcast for this Friday, October 17th, 2025.
You can follow our show on Apple Podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Any feedback you have, we're always happy to hear it, good, bad, or indifferent. Write us an email at onpolitics@tvo.org. Please include your first and last name and where you're located.
This week's episode was edited and produced by Matthew O'Mara, video editing by Colin Kish.
Production support from Jonathan Hallowell and TVO's Digital Media Services team.
Lauren Pugh is the executive producer of Digital. John Ferry is vice president, programming and content.
We always like to give special thanks to our terrific crew for setting up the story here on, not the story, the set, the studio.
Yes.
I knew it was a word that started with ST. Setting up the studio here on the 5th floor. We're getting punchy, kid. Let's get out of here. Until next week, everybody. Bye-bye.